So that's the drawings Audran made to prepare the new cartoons. I'll show you only two drawings. As an annotation on the drawings indicate in the King's Chamber peace and heroic virtue, indicate in the King's Chamber peace and heroic virtue were to be represented. In the main drawing, peace is represented in accordance with Cesare Ripa's iconology, translated by Jean Baudouin in 1636, namely a woman crowned with an olive tree, holding a sheaf of earth and having a cornucopia at her side. In the foreground, another woman wearing a crenellated crown is transported. So the piece. In the foreground, another woman wearing a crenellated crown is transported on a chariot pulled by lions. She is holding a cornucopia. This is clearly the goddess Cybele, symbol of fertility. On the sketch of the same drawing, we find the same elements arranged a little differently. So there is a second project for the King Chamber. But I haven't finished with the precedent. But what was the piece are we talking about here? We can think that this allegory alludes here to the War of the Spanish Succession, which is only just beginning. On November 16, 1700, Louis XIV ratified the will of the last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, which allowed his grandson, the Duke of Anjou, to ascend the throne of Spain under the name of Philip V. However, in the invasion of the Spanish Netherlands by the French troops in February 1701, following the acceptance of the will, provoked the wrath of the other European powers who formed a coalition against France. But in Marly, where the king received selected people, the latter, despite his warlike intentions, clearly preferred to present himself as a pacemaker rather than a factor of conflict. As for the heroic virtue that appears in this, as for the heroic virtue that appears in the second drawing, it is a notion that also appears in Cesare Ripa's iconology, where it is represented by a statue of Hercule dressed in a lion skin, holding the club in one hand and 3 golden apples from the garden of the Hesperids in the other. These apples correspond to the 3 kinds of heroic virtues. It is noted that the drawing reproduces exactly the summary engraving of Ripa's iconology. Needless to say, this allegory is also a direct allusion to the supposed qualities of the king. The projects intended for Madame de Maintenon, for their part, are allusive to the 9 muses. The king's mistress is in some way assimilated here, according to the fashion of mythological disguise, quite common at the time, to a muse who inspires and advises the king. 4 muses are mentioned in the drawings. Terpsichore associated with dance, Euterpe with music, Calliope with poetry and music, and Polymnia with rhetoric and memory. These thematic associations are those that are also found in Cesare Ripa's iconology. Exceptionally, on the drawings intended for Madame de Maintenon antechamber, Audran indicated the colors that he intended to use for this project. The project was very rich, and the gold background was planned in the niches in particular. Three other drawings were intended for the apartment of the king's brother. The 2 largest projects are undoubtedly a variation of the same subject. The first one, the second one, which is just a variation of the first. And perhaps in the collection, so you have a detail. And perhaps here, a sketch for the same drawings. Very interesting. Unexpectedly, the iconography of this project concerns acrobatic shows. It is quite rare at the time to find such secular representation in official interiors. This choice is perhaps an initiative of Audran, unless he followed an express recommendation that had been given to him. There's shows with acrobats, but also magicians and tamers clearly correspond to real performances that the royal family had been able to attend. On the 3 projects, we notice the presence of monkeys that Audran boldly introduced into his decoration work, and which are the mark of his taste for the mischief. The iconography planned for Monsieur gives him a rather unusual image of carelessness, and it is difficult to know exactly what message was wanted to convey here. The last you have a second drawing for the same apartment of Monsieur, and the last project was therefore intended for the Duke of Burgundy. Its theme is that of games that were regularly associated with childhood and youth. On the left, we notice in particular a young princess sitting in a chariot pulled by 2 dogs, or in the center a child playing with soap bubbles. So these projects were not realized, but we do not know why. We can suppose that their cost with the paintings of large cartoons and long weavings called the king, who did not want to wait while the war was ruining his finances. We can also possibly imagine that the subjects, very new for some, did not please Louis XIV or Madame de Maintenon, whose rigidity is well known. In addition to the fact that the identification I propose today allows us to know the destination and to date these drawings by Audran, it also allows us to consider Audran as a major player in the work of Marly, while his name has practically never been mentioned concerning this castle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Again, I'm Jeffrey Freeman, Assistant Curator here at the Legion of Honor. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Pascal-François Bertrand, an Emeritus Professor of Art History at Université Bordeaux Montaigne in Pessac, France, and a 2019 Getty Rothschild Fellow. Bless you. His work questions the history of tapestry within the history of artistic creation, according to three complementary methods: historiographical approach, a study on the close relationship between painting and tapestry, and a social approach of the medium. With co-author Teresa Bremer-David, he has recently prepared an annotated edition of the Registres de Fabrication de la Manufacture Royale de Tapisserie de Beauvais, preserved at the Mobilier National Paris. He has also been involved in a multidisciplinary research project in collaboration with Arches Sciences Bordeaux on the reconstruction of the original colors of an Aubusson tapestry. So welcome, Pascal-François Bertrand.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You hear me well? Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey, for this kind introduction, and thank you, Tom, for inviting me to this symposium for your beautiful exhibition on the Battle of Pavia. And, yes, I'm sorry. Doesn't work. I'm sorry. Good. Thank you. Depicting war was one of the most valued subjects for princes. Their military deeds, drawn, painted, or woven in the large format, were a means of asserting their power and expressing their glory as knights. The Battle of Pavia, woven for Charles V, clearly attests this observation. The prince could also be portrayed as a hero of antiquity, such as Alexander the Great or Scipio the African, or as a warrior of Greco-Roman mythology, such as Jason, Theseus, or Achilles. The latter is the Greek hero of the Trojan War. A war, before being an epic historical film directed by Wolfgang Petersen, was considered as a true war, not a mythological one. Prior to that, it had been the subject of an abundant and constantly renewed literature called the epic cycle. The most famous poem is Homer's Iliad. Also, its plot unfolds over a few weeks near the end of the 10 years-long war, from Achilles' anger to the two Priams pleading for the body of Hector. There are many other stories in the epic cycle recounting the exploit of Achilles, the Achaean or Greek hero, and Hector, the Trojan one. Both were the most valiant of all the warriors. The narrative owed its success to the description of the characters' heroic values. According to Plutarch, Alexander the Great, one of the most famous rulers of antiquity, had learned the art of war by reading the Iliad, and so to be equal to the hero Achilles. The glorious legend of Troy was also at the origin The glorious legend of Troy was also at the origin of the creation of several European peoples. The Trojan heroes and their allies were the mythical ancestor of the new rulers. For example, Francus, a friend, a brother, or a son of Hector, as the case may be, was the founder of Paris. The legend mostly guaranteed the prestige, cohesion, and ethnic unity of the nation. Famous Trojan tapestry hangings were woven in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. This story and several related themes of the epic cycle, such as the story of Achilles, were very appreciated and were still being woven in the 17th and 18th century. At least 4 tapestry series inspired by the Iliad and other narrative texts were woven in the French royal factories of the Gobelins and Beauvais for the French king and some powerful courtiers. How can we explain the persistence of this theme and medium? Drawing on a few particularly significant examples, I'll show you how the main facts of the Trojan legend were selected according to commissioners or recipients of the various editions woven in order to prize the glory of these princes. Examples of virtues. That's what we remember first and foremost. Achilles is one of the best examples of a valiant warrior, while Hector is a perfect courtly knight. The subject of the first tapestry series, woven for the very young King of France, depicts 3 episodes from the Iliad, giving the tapestry hanging its title. 2 other subjects from Virgil's Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphoses complete the series. Until now, commentaries have focused on the beauty of the painting and served as cartoons for these tapestries rather than to the tapestries themselves. They emphasize the art of the painter Antoine Coipel, in particular his coloring, which owes much to Rubens, his genius for highly theatrical compositions, and his ability to paint the expression of the hero's passions. Have a look at the 2 first tapestries. The Wrath of Achilles tapestry depicts the moment when Agamemnon, leader of the Achaean army, comes to take Achilles' captive Briseis. Agamemnon sees this as a compensation for having had to return one of his own captives, Chryseis, to her father, Chryses, priest of Apollo, the god who had brought the plague upon the Achaean army. Achilles, furious at losing Briseis, puts his hand on his sword to attack Agamemnon. Then he refuses to fight until his compatriot Patroclus is killed by Hector. While anger may today be seen as a reprehensible action, it was one justified because taking back a slave from a warrior's spoil of war was considered, in the word of chivalry, to be a wound of honor, the most difficult to cure. The second tapestry in the middle, the second tapestry shows Hector bidding farewell to his wife Andromache and their son Astyanax on the ramparts of Troy before having to face the Greek. He invokes the god and asks them to protect his family while he is away. The brave Hector appears ready to fight for the glory of his camp. As long as Hector is alive, Troy will resist. At the same time, he is portrayed as the protector of his wife and family. The subjects are explained by a Latin legend inscribed in a medallion at the bottom of the tapestry. The effect is to enable the viewer to easily recall the episode depicted. This makes for a clear, unambiguous understanding of the subject. We are witnessing a return of the legend that once existed in tapestry and painting, but which had disappeared. Under Louis XIV, the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture debated the titles of the painting on the vault of the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Should they be written in Latin or French? French won the day after lengthy discussion and an initial choice of Latin. The debate, part of the quarrel between the ancient and the modern, is an important one, demonstrating the need for a title to remember the subject depicted in painting and tapestry alike. The choice of the Latin attests a conservative point of view. While the subjects are now well understood, it is not yet clear why the French crown wishes to have a tapestry hanging depicting subjects from the Trojan War. The same is true for the two tapestry series, also depicting events from the Trojan War, woven for Cardinal Armand Gaston de Rohan. The French ecclesiastic members of the whole military nobility own a first six-piece story of Achilles, which was hung in two adjoining rooms of his Paris mansion, the Hôtel de Rohan, now the Archives Nationales. At the time of his death, only two pieces are known to exist. The first tapestry relates to Achilles' yaws, when he is recognized by Ulysses while in hiding, disguised as a girl among Lycomedes' daughters to avoid going into battle. It is described in Stas' Achilleid. The second tapestry shows Achilles' death, the moment when Paris shoots an arrow into the only fragile part of his body, his heel, because his mother held him there when she plunged him into the river Styx to make him immortal. The Cardinal's second tapestry hanging, which was in an apartment in the Louvre at the time of his death, has no precise title in his after-death inventory. It is designated by the title of the first pieces, The Abdication of Helen, which shows the random nature of a hanging's title. The Abdication of Helen is not described in the Iliad, but in the Cypria, a last epic poem chronologically preceding the Iliad in the Trojan cycle and attributed to Stasinus of Cyprus. Here again, also the subject is clearly identified. This does not explain the reasons for weaving these tapestries relating to the Trojan War. We know that tapestries generally represent universal subjects in which every courtier or honest man can be recognized as himself. They depict the moral values that a prince or courtier must possess if he wants to hold his rank. We also know that works of art created in the royal domain have a precise meaning, which results from a particular intention, which can be identified by clues. These clues, which have attracted little interest from historians, need to be examined, as they help to clarify the context in which the iconographic programs of these hangings were developed and to answer the question that what was the significance of owning a hanging of the Iliad or the Trojan War at the beginning of the Régence. Heraldry and emblems. The border of the tapestries provide clues to the circumstances surrounding the commissioning of these hangings and answer the question of why a young king and a wealthy clergyman wishes to own tapestries depicting the Trojan War. The identity of the patron is known from heraldry, the science of coat of arms. The arms of France, blue with 3 golden fleur-de-lis, are at the center of the upper borders, surrounded by the color of the Order of Saint Michael and the Holy Spirit, surmounted by a royal crown and flanked by 2 large wings. The arms of Cardinal de Rohan are also at the center of the upper borders of the other 2 tapestry hangings, here on the right. In the center of the vertical borders is a medallion containing a motto and a motif and a Latin motto. What is the link to the owner of the tapestries? In the Iliad series, the medallion represents the first a nude female figure standing on a globe, holding a sun in one hand, a palm in the other. The second medallion depicts a clothed figure holding a trumpet. The first figure is that of truth, as described by Cesare Ripa in his Iconologia, as Jean shows you just before. The new figure hold a sun in one hand and a palm in the other. And the second figure is that of renown. The associated Latin words, vis unita fortior, found in the Iliad, mean united strength is stronger. It was a formula in vogue throughout the 18th century, taken up as a motto. The combination of the figures of truth and fame and the words create a motto that asserts a desire for national unity at the beginning of the interregnum period between the death of Louis XIV, 1715, and the coronation of Louis V in 1722, in order to have discord. Shortly before his death, Louis XIV wanted to appoint one of his legitimate sons as regent, the Duc du Maine, because the future Louis XIV was just 5 years old, too young to reign. But Philippe d'Orléans, at the late king's will, overturned to become regent. He had distinguished himself as a valiant soldier. When he took power, he brought about a change in the way of the French government. To consolidate his authority, he introduced an innovative political system, the polysynody, consisting of several councils, the effect of which was to divide power between himself, the high nobility, and parliamentarians. The regent needed the unity of the nation, if not won, at least affirmed. This is the message conveyed by these emblems. No, it's okay. By this emblems, which seems to be the first one used by the future Louis XV. The 2 Trojan War tapestry hangings owned by Cardinal de Rohan were made at the invitation of the Iliad Tapestry series for the king. His hanging of the story of Achilles features one of his family's mottos in the borders. It's a lightning-struck tree stump with a newborn branch accompanied by the word et adhuc spes durat avorum. I quote, ancestors' hopes last forever. This motto can also be found in the border of an important Italian village scenes tapestry series that his brother, Hercule Mériadec de Rohan, Duc de Soubise, had around the same time ordered to the Beauvais manufacture to decorate his sumptuous Hôtel de Soubise. The virtues of the heroes of the Trojan legend matched the dues required to the very young king and the prince of the church. The Iliad Tapestry series thus displays the virtues that a young prince must have to reign, to win concord, as the figures of truth and fame underline. The Tapestry series of Cardinal de Rohan bears witness to the pomp and splendor deployed by him to maintain his rank and honor his family and official position. As Prince Bishop of Strasbourg, the king representative in Alsace, cardinal officiating in Rome, Grand Chaplain of France, and member of the Regents' Council, it was very close to the region. Only wealthy courtiers, very close to the crown, could order and buy such tapestries at the Gobelin manufactory. The theory of decorum. Under the guise of transmitting military knowledge and teaching the virtues required of a young prince, the Trojan legend was also appropriate for the decoration woven for ambassadors, since Homeric heroes were not only valiant warriors, they were also brilliant political orators, soothsayers, doctors, and poets. Diplomacy is the art conducting negotiations to reach an agreement, for example, to resolve a conflict without violence. The ambassador and the soldiers are the two main actors in interstate relations. A new hanging depicting the Trojan War was woven at the Manufacture de Beauvais in the 1760s to be given as a gift for diplomats. Shortly before, an antiquarian and man of letters, Comte de Calus, set out to produce a book that would be useful for learning about the poems of Homer and Virgil, which have been forgotten. He thus described, I quote, the most brilliant events, end quote, of these poems to make them easier for readers to understand and remember. Calus gives a version of the poem in the form of tableaux, each corresponding to an action that he describes with great precision, setting out the whole story and then describing in detail, taking care to show the connections between the different elements of the story. In his meticulously detailed descriptions, he accurately presents the clothing, the arrangement of objects, the perspective, and the drawing and colors, so that painters can find in his work practical data to be able to represent and paint these stories well. Part of the book's preface was devoted to observations on the principle of appropriateness in Homer's poem. On this slide, I'm showing a tapestry from the set presented to Count of Fuentes, Spanish ambassador to France in 1764 to 1772, which is part of the collection of the Patrimonio Nacional in Madrid today, as the San Francisco Museums preserve the Bozetto of Jean-Baptiste Deshaies, the promising young painter who executed the cartoons. It is worth noting the simplification brought about when the work was translated into tapestry, with the number of figures considerably reduced. I close with the tapestry offered with two other ones as a vacation gift to the Comte de la Marmora, Sardinian ambassador to Paris in 1773. These tapestries are now in the dining room of the Hôtel de Pontalba, the residence of the ambassador of the United States of America in Paris. A comparison of the tapestry with a description of the picture by Caylus shows that the subject taken from the poem is as valuable for the aestheticism of the depicted action as for the exemplary value of the virtue itself. I translate. Achilles, in front of his tent, plunged into a sorrow that is all the duller and more despondent as it follows the most violent anger, and as this same sorrow is caused by the despair of pride and love equally offended. Achilles sees Briseis' slave. This beautiful slave shows him the most tender sorrow. Patroclus, who shares his friend's grief, hands her over the two heralds sent by Agamemnon to remove her from Achilles' tent. Their attitude, mingled with fear and respect, presents not only an advantageous contrast in itself, but a confirmation of the characters and traits depicted in the previous pictures. End of the translation. Woven for a very young prince who was not yet at the command, for a church official particularly close to power, and for diplomats, tapestries relating to the Trojan War and values of their recipients were always convey a beautiful image, not an image of historical truth, but one of propaganda. Thank you for listening.
So thank you. And our next speaker is Helen Wyld. Helen is a Senior Curator of Historic Textiles at the National Museum Scotland, where she is responsible for European and Scottish textiles from the medieval period to 1850. Prior to joining the National Museums, Wyld worked for the National Trust, the National Portrait Gallery London, the National Trust for Scotland, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She has published widely on the history of tapestry in Britain and Europe, and her book, The Art of Tapestry, was published by Philip Wilson and the National Trust in 2022. Her research interests include textiles and the sacred in early modern England and Scotland, Renaissance jewels, knitting in Northern Europe, and the global context for Scotland's textile manufacturers. Wyld is also completing a part-time PhD at the University of Edinburgh on tapestry and ritual at the court of Charles I. So welcome, Helen Wyld.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I'd just like to thank Tom and everyone at the Fine Art Museums for inviting me to be here and to see this amazing exhibition. So thank you. So a small 17th century tapestry woven after Titian's Supper at Emmaus has hung in the President's lodging at St John's College, Oxford, for as long as anyone there can remember. It's only been the subject of one brief publication in 1926, and since then has been referred to a handful of times as a footnote to studies of English tapestry. Its small scale and anomalous subject matter clearly play a part in this neglect. It's not as impressive as the large tapestry sets of its age, and as a woven rendering of a painting, it lacks originality. But today, I aim to show that this tapestry contains within it the elements of the fiercest theological debates of the Reformation period over the propriety of images in the church and the nature of the Eucharistic rite. The location of this tapestry at St John's is no accident of history. The college was the school and spiritual home of William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury under King Charles I, and the most divisive figure in 17th century English and Scottish religious politics. In this paper, I will subject the tapestry to a close reading, using as my primary source the material, the written accounts of Laud's trial, which took place in 1644, where religious tapestries emerge as highly controversial objects. By reading the tapestry in this way, I hope to show that the standard art historical approaches to the tapestry medium, which have assessed this as an object of minor importance, are limited, as they view tapestry primarily as a visual medium. In England in the 1630s and 40s, tapestry was still viewed as a ritual medium, and its status was perhaps more contested than ever at this crucial moment. The tapestry is a roughly life-sized woven iteration of Titian's Supper at Emmaus, painted in 1533-4 for a courtier of the Duke of Mantua, and now in the Louvre. The picture came into the possession of the British King Charles I in 1627 as part of the Mantua purchase and was shipped to London the following year. 3 woven marks on the galloon of the tapestry tell us that it was woven at Mortlake, the workshop established by Charles's father James I outside London in 1619, and that it dates to before 1636, when the workshop's director, Francis Crane, and his chief weaver, Philip de Macht, both died. If we allow time for a cartoon to be created, the tapestry can thus be dated to between around 1629 and 1636. The cartoon for the borders was probably the work of Francis Klein, the artist attached to the Mortlake workshop. The Supper at Emmaus tapestry was not alone in linking the media of tapestry and painting in Caroline, England. Most famously, Charles I's acquisition of the cartoons for Raphael's Acts of the Apostles in 1623 showed an early ambition to nourish the Mortlake workshop's designs in line with his interest as a connoisseur and collector of Italian painting. Even closer comparisons can be found in a now lost tapestry after Titian's Diana and Callisto, and in 2 small tapestries woven at Mortlake after painted portraits. Of course, these works could be viewed in the context of the many painted copies that Charles I commissioned after works in his collection. The Supper at Emmaus, on the other hand, does more than copy Titian's canvas. Borders are added, which, as we will see, suggest a profound meditation on the subject of the painting. We thus need to view the Supper at Emmaus not only in terms of the relationship between tapestry and painting, but as a document of the theological and liturgical climate of England in the 1630s. As such, it represents a marriage of the old language of ritual and the new language of connoisseurship. Supporting this approach is the provenance of the tapestry, which indicates an association not with Charles, but with his archprelate, William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury from 1633, and the architect of the controversial religious policies of Charles's reign. The tapestry's been at St John's College in Oxford since at least 1744. Its early provenance is not recorded. The college, and this is the college where Laud was, in his own words, bred up as a student, fellow, and later president. He bestowed a number of gifts and benefactions on the college, most notably improvements to the chapel, and the magnificent Canterbury quadrangle shown in this slide. So my hypothesis is that Laud commissioned the Supper at Emmaus tapestry, which reached St John's either as a gift or a bequest. The strongest evidence linking the tapestry to Laud comes from his trial, which took place in 1644. Laud's unpopularity had grown during the 1630s due to the programme of church reforms he introduced, which sought to promote liturgical ritual, decoration in the church, and conformity of worship. He had been arrested as one of the king's evil councillors in 1641, accused of treason. At this date, Parliament felt unable to attack the king directly, and Laud was a proxy, although the king himself would be tried and executed just 5 years later. The articles against Laud fell into two categories: actions that sought to subvert royal power, and changes to religious worship, which, according to his accusers, constituted an attempt to move the nation towards Catholicism. Among these latter accusations was the charge that the chapel at Laud's official residence of Lambeth Palace, there was the picture of Christ receiving his Last Supper with his disciples in a piece of arras hanging just behind the midst of the altar. We may never know whether this was the tapestry now at St. John's, and the reference to the Lord's Supper almost certainly refers to the Last Supper, which is not the same as the Supper at Emmaus, and Laud's accusers would have understood this. But the accusation does give us a context for how our tapestry would have been used and understood. It's worth briefly giving some context for the trial record. The evidence against Laud was gathered by the Puritan lawyer and polemicist William Prynne, who published the official account of the trial under the title Canterbury's Doom in 1646. The trial itself and Prynne's publication were certainly works of propaganda, but there was also a personal dimension. Prynne had twice been arrested and tried for his Puritan writings during the 1630s under Laud's own direction. Laud was closely involved in censorship. Prynne had had his ears cut off, his nose slit, and his cheeks branded SL for seditious libeller. Prynne joked that the brands on his cheeks actually stood for stigma of Laud. In preparation for the trial, Prynne visited Lambeth Palace, where he gathered detailed evidence of the contents of Laud's study and library and the decoration of his chapel, all of which were used. Significantly for our purposes, in his published account, Prynne chose to place these accusations relating to Laud's personal worship at the very beginning of the proceedings, even though they actually took place halfway through the trial. So to Prynne, the hanging of a tapestry over the altar was among the most damning pieces of evidence of Laud's personal complicity in treasonous and popish activity. And it's worth also noting, alongside the accusation we're looking at today, Prynne also gave a detailed critique of the stained glass windows and the altar at Lambeth Palace, and of a second tapestry that was used in the King's Chapel at Whitehall. Prynne's evidence is by far the most detailed written account of his age, of the ways in which tapestries were understood to operate during the 1630s, and shows us that pre-Reformation modes of thought about religious objects lived on in the minds of both Puritans and Laudians. And my wider thesis that I'm not going to talk about today is that we need to use this understanding to really understand how tapestries operated in the court as well as in religious settings. Prynne's accusation focuses on the fact that the tapestry contained an image of Christ and that it hung over the altar. Laud countered the accusation by quoting Calvin, who did not disapprove of images that had an instructive purpose, thus referring to the important distinction between holy images and narrative images. But Prynne insisted on the importance of the location in the propriety of images, even making a delicate distinction between different parts of the chapel. He said the arras hanging was rather suited to the crucifixes in the glass window over it and other images of Christ in that chapel than to the place or Lord's table where it hanged. The table and sacramental elements themselves, with the usual participation of them every month, being sufficient to mind us of our Saviour's Last Supper, Passion, Death too, and to show them forth till he come. In this exchange, both Laud and Prynne refer to Calvin, whose warnings about images revolve around two dangers: the blasphemous implications of representing God, and the danger of idolatry, or the worship of images, which was heightened when images were placed within the church. But while Laud seeks to define his tapestry as a narrative image and not an idol or occult image, Prynne ignores these distinctions. He's interested instead in the location, and in particular the proximity to the altar, thus recognizing its potential as a ritual object. The particular danger of an image over an altar related, of course, to what took place at the altar, the Eucharistic rite. In the Catholic Church, the doctrine of transubstantiation meant that at the celebration of Mass, the bread and wine were transformed literally into the real body and blood of Christ. Calvinists and Puritans such as Prynne argued that this rite merely represented Christ's sacrifice. By distinguishing between the power of an image over an altar and one in a window behind an altar, Prynne acknowledges the potential for images to become implicated in the notion of presence, whose nexus within the church was the altar. This understanding of church decoration and ritual informs all the accusations levelled against Laud at his trial. Under Article 7, that he hath traitorously endeavoured to alter and subvert God's true religion by laws established in this realm, and instead thereof to set up popish superstition and idolatry. But herein lay the central misunderstanding of Laud's trial. Prynne adopted an orthodox Calvinist position and chose to understand Laud's concern with ritual and decoration as an expression of affinity with Catholicism. But Laud's most developed theological contribution was a debate in which he actually set out his opposition to the Catholic position. In his conference with the Jesuit Fisher, Laud made it clear that he did not believe in transubstantiation. He began his discussion of the Eucharist by stating what he saw as a universal position. And then he outlined the divergences on either side, on the Calvinist side and the Catholic side from this, and he concluded with a pragmatic view that if this argument be good, then even for this consent, it is safer communicating with the Church of England than with the Roman or the Lutheran, because all agree in this truth. He argued that Christ was present in spirit, but not materially in the Eucharist, and said, "The conversion of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ is substantial, but after a secret and effable manner, and not like in all things to any natural conversion whatsoever." Laud's reforms to church ritual and decoration, while outwardly similar to Catholic practice, sought to recognize the sanctity of the church, and in particular the altar, and to show due reverence to God. He did not seek to convert the nation to Catholicism. Instead, he framed his mission as returning the English church to what he viewed as its ancient purity, sanctified by centuries of tradition, but free from the errors of Rome. This concern with continuity may be one of the reasons that Titian's painting was selected by Laud. Visually, the Supper at Emmaus speaks to us in powerful ways that complement the ritual meanings embodied in the tapestry. The subject of Titian's painting is drawn from the Gospel of St. Luke, which describes how, after Christ's resurrection, 3 apostles on the way to Emmaus met a stranger who they invited to dine with them. And it came to pass, as he sat at meat with them, he took bread and blessed it, and brake and gave to them. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. Titian's painting represents this moment of recognition. But its visual strategy collapses the events described in the biblical passage. Christ has broken the bread and is blessing it, but has not yet handed it to the apostles. However, they recognize him already. This is therefore not a narrative image, as Laud had argued in his trial, but a symbolic one. It's a cult image, a devotional image. Since its early appearance in Christian iconography in around the 9th century, the subject of the Supper at Emmaus had a Eucharistic character. In Titian's rendering, this is emphasized by the bread and wine and the altar-like table with its rich carpet and linen cloth. The composition also echoes the established iconography of the Last Supper. But whereas the Last Supper is an image of Christ instructing the apostles to remember his sacrifice through the Eucharist, the Supper at Emmaus fulfills the promise of resurrection and the promise that Christ will be present after his death when his apostles remember him in the breaking of bread. It's a meditation on the question of presence. In our tapestry, the question of presence is highlighted in numerous ways. The inner architectural border includes a number of elements which amplify the scriptural text: the sacred monogram, swags of fruit referring to the resurrection, putti with attributes of Moses and John the Baptist. Now, in the use of iconographic borders to shape the reading of the central scene, this is very typical of its age, and it shares a visual language with the Mortlake Acts of the Apostles, which also have an architectural surround with putti holding allegorical emblems. But our tapestry deploys a further visual strategy. Surrounding the architectural border is a woven rendering of a fringe. Now, on one level, this could be read as a visual game, contrasting the real borders with the woven image. but that point had already been made by the architectural surround. Why add a fringe as well? On this point, an obvious comparison may already have occurred to some of you, Rubens's Triumph of the Eucharist. Here also, the main action of typological scenes and a triumphal procession takes place on a series of fictive hangings suspended between fictive columns within a rendering of a church interior, thus creating two woven realities. Interpretations of Rubens's visual device often cite the influence of the fictive hangings painted in the Sala di Constantino that we saw yesterday. They seek an art historical lineage, but Rubens, like the author of our Tapestry, was in fact referring to a rich iconographic tradition relating to the notion of revelation at the consecration of the Eucharistic host. As Victor Schmidt has observed in relation to Florentine painting, fictive curtains were common on religious paintings, particularly in the 15th century, but they appear exclusively on cult images, devotional images, not narrative images. These devices refer both to the actual veiling of cult images in the church, but also to their revelatory nature. The fictive curtains refer to a pictorial unveiling of the sacred achieved by the image itself. The use of curtains in religious images also relates to the presentation of the Eucharist. Indeed, from the 13th century, sight became especially important in the celebration of Mass. The host was elevated at the consecration to allow its transformed substance to be seen. The visual became central to the ritual enactment of Christ's revelation. And this is just one example cited by Schmidt of a tabernacle where the real and the represented revelation are sort of conflated, and there's a pair of angels pulling back curtains. And I think the angels in our tapestry echo this common device of angels pulling back curtains. The subject of the Supper at Emmaus obviously relates exactly to this question of Christ's visible presence, and the two putti echo the common device of angels drawing back curtains. But in our tapestry, the image of Christ is not revealed by the drawing back of a curtain. It appears on a curtain, both literally, as it is woven on a tapestry, and symbolically via the woven fringe. Here too, there are direct comparators in religious iconography. Figurative tapestries with images of Christ, the Virgin, and saints were often used as altar frontals, as well as embroideries, and it was common for real fringes to be applied to them, partly to enhance the adornment of the altar, but partly, as Joseph Brown suggests, to retain the altar frontal's character as a curtain. The symbolic nature of the fringes applied to altar frontals is revealed by the survival of a handful of examples where fictive fringes are woven into tapestry altar frontals, and this is one where you can see along the top a colourful fringe woven hanging down over the tapestry. The altar frontal was there not just to adorn the altar or carry an image. As a textile, it signified the revelatory nature of the ritual of the Mass. In the case of the Supper at Emmaus, the central image itself is revelatory. While I've been at pains in this paper to show the continuity of the Supper at Emmaus tapestry with pre-Reformation ritual and iconographic modes, it was nonetheless created at a moment of conflict, both theological and actual, over the nature of the Christian faith. In this regard, we must ask again why the Supper at Emmaus was chosen as a subject, rather than the Last Supper, or one of the subjects more traditionally associated with altar tapestries. Titian's painting was created on the eve of a century of turbulence in the Western Church, a period whose repercussions Laud, Rubens, and Prynne were all grappling with. In one sense, this image, with its calm certainty, may have appealed to Laud's desire to smooth over the rupture of the Reformation and stress continuity with a historic church, a desire evident throughout his writings on church reform. But the subject had gained a new meaning by the early 17th century. Two near-contemporary images are united in a new questioning of the visibility of Christ. They're both complex images which we don't have the time to go into in detail, but Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, painted in 1601, uses a heightened optical reality to create in the viewer a sense of Christ's proximity, while the ambiguous spatial qualities of the scene simultaneously create distance and uncertainty. And as Lorenzo Piccolo has shown, Caravaggio also manipulates the iconographic tradition representing Christ as young and beardless, thus initially inhibiting his recognition. A more radical uncertainty characterizes Rembrandt's 1628 rendering of the subject, which takes the unprecedented step of suggesting the moment of Christ's disappearance from view by inverting the usual relationship between light and darkness. While some critics have sought to cast Rembrandt's picture as entirely secular in character, this shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the climate in which he worked. Working in opposing theological environments, both Caravaggio and Rembrandt identify a new uncertainty in relation to the notion of Christ's presence. By reproducing a central image created before the current age of doubt, Laud's Supper at Emmaus tapestry seeks to forestall uncertainty and present a unified and reassuring vision where Christ's presence is not questioned. But the tapestry contains the seeds of its own uncertainty. With its addition of not one additional reality, as in Rubens's Eucharist, but two, the architectural frame and the woven fringe, the tapestry's insistence on presence itself reveals a central doubt. The double reassurance of the border, with its claims of concordance, revelation, and resurrection, stand in for the century of turmoil that stood between Titian's painting and Laud's reweaving of it. In the 1630s, the Eucharist was more contested than ever, and Laud's middle way could not reconcile the fraught question of presence.
Thank you so much, Helen. And now we will have our fourth and final speaker of this morning session. And then a reminder, we'll have a Q&A for all the speakers of this session following. So I'm pleased to now introduce Dr. Lorraine Carafel, an associate professor of art and design history at Parsons School of Design in New York. In her research, Dr. Carafel specializes in the history of European tapestries in the 15th to 18th centuries and has authored Raphael's Tapestries, the Grotesques of Leo X, with Yale University Press in 2016, and with co-author Elizabeth Cleland, Tapestries from the Burrell Collection in 2017. She has contributed to major exhibition catalogs for the Metropolitan Museum of Art and for the Grimaldi Gallery in Dresden. Her current book project looks at the design, production, reproduction, and display of tapestries in Europe in the 15th to 18th centuries and will be published by Yale University Press. So welcome, Dr. Carafel.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff, for the introduction, and thank you, Tom, for inviting me here today and for the wonderful exhibition upstairs. I'll be talking today about tapestries designed by the Renaissance master Raphael in his workshop, the Acts of the Apostles, the Grotesques of Leo X, and the Playing Children. And here we see pieces from those three sets. I'd like to explore their designs and the complex messages, the propaganda, that their imagery was intended to convey. Raphael designed the tapestries for Pope Leo X, the first Medici Pope. And the cartoons were produced by Raphael in his workshop and were sent to Brussels, where they were splendidly woven in wool, silk, and metal-wrapped thread by the master weaver-producer Peter van Elst. And here we see a self-portrait of Raphael from about 1506 at the left, and Raphael's portrait of Leo X with Cardinals Giulio de' Medici and Luigi de' Rossi from 1518 at the right. Pope Leo reigned from 1513 to 1521. For Leo, tapestries represented wealth and magnificence. They also served as a calculated and powerful means of communication. The 10-piece Acts of the Apostles, designed 1515-16, which are still in the Vatican collection, were conceived as large-scale woven pictures and feature dramatic narratives from the lives of Saints Peter and Paul founders of the Christian Church in Rome. Borders augment the main scenes. Stories from the life of Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, the future Pope Leo X, appear on the lower borders, and mythological and allegorical figures lauding the Medici family on the side borders. And on the left, we see the charge to Peter, and on the right, Paul preaching at Athens. And here we see two tapestries from the 8-piece Grotesques of Leo X, designed about 1516-18, the Labors of Hercules on the left and the Triumph of Bacchus on the right. Raphael's workshop composed the grotesques in an innovative antique style, imitating ancient Roman wall painting. Although the original set is lost, later reweavings allow us to study the designs, and these were made about 1540 for King Henry VIII of England and are now housed at Hampton Court Palace. And we saw some other examples of reweavings in Jean Vittet's talk earlier. A third set of 20 tapestries, designed about 1519-20, feature winged cherubs playing with various objects, animals, birds, and fish. The children's activities are set against a relief-like flat ground, draped with verdant garlands, lush with fruit and flowers. While the Vatican tapestries are lost, some of the designs are known through reweavings, and here we see 4 pieces from the 17th century now in Budapest. While tapestries are prized for their portability, each of Raphael's sets was made for a specific space at the Vatican. The acts for the Sistine Chapel, the Pope's private chapel at the right, the grotesques for the Hall of the Pontiffs, a large audience hall on the Vatican's first floor, and the playing children for the Hall of Constantine, a large audience hall on the Vatican's second floor. Raphael's designs offered compelling and innovative imagery, and underlying these compositions and the specific choice of subjects and elements are potent political messages. This propaganda promoted Pope Leo X, his papal reign, and his family, the Medici. The tapestries also responded to specific contemporary events, policies, and challenges of the papacy and of Pope Leo's reign, which I'd like to explore more here. So in this paper, I'd like to first review the imagery and messages in the acts and the grotesques. Then I'd like to focus some attention on the playing children, a set with intriguing allegorical designs that has not yet been fully deciphered. So for the acts, scholars have much discussed the underlying meaning of the compositions, notably John Shearman in his seminal 1972 study. The tapestries assert the primacy of the papacy and the mission of the Church, and their message ultimately served to reinforce Leo X's authority as Pope. And here we see St. Peter on the right, chosen by Christ to lead the Christian Church in Rome. On the left, St. Paul, the great missionary, preaching at Athens. The specific subjects selected for the 10 weavings were taken from the Bible's Acts of the Apostles, and they highlight in particular 2 aspects of the lives of St. Peter and St. Paul: their ability to punish and their ability to heal, which we see here with the healing of the lame man on the left and the sacrifice at Lystra on the right. In the tapestry at the left, Peter extends his hand to a disabled man who's begging at the entrance to the Temple of Jerusalem. He bids him in the name of Jesus to rise and walk, according to the biblical text. At the right, Paul, who we see at the far right in red, has just cured a lame man. We see the man in the crowd at the left. He's dropped his crutch and rushes forward with amazement and gratitude. The Acts of the Apostles were planned not long after Leo's election to the papacy. Under his predecessor, Pope Julius II, the Church faced factions and dissenters who questioned the role of the Pope. The rebellious Council of Pisa, for example, called for a governing body to oversee the Pope, essentially limiting his power. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici had forged a reputation as a skilled diplomat after a recent disastrous event, his capture by the French in 1512 at the Battle of Ravenna. He was seen as a leader who could unify and revive a divided church. On Pope Leo's election, court poets praised him as a medicus who, like Christ, would heal the people, who would bring unity, justice, and renewal to the church. For example, in a motet, the papal musician Hendrik Isaacs sang of the Good Shepherd, the medicus, who will heal the wounds of his flock and give them pax aurea, golden peace. Positioning Pope Leo as a healing force, the medicus or doctor even played on the family's name, Medicus Medici. The Acts tapestries then, with their focus on Peter and Paul, who were empowered by Christ himself, asserted the authority of the papacy. The tapestries also depict biographical references to Pope Leo. Scenes from his life appear in the lower border. For example, here we see from the charge to Peter, the sack of the Medici palace, with Giovanni de' Medici at the far right, escaping from the fray, disguised as a Dominican monk. In 1512, the family returned triumphantly to Florence, not long before Leo added fame to the family with his papal election. We see a symbolic reference to this dramatic turn of events in the side border for the Charge to Peter tapestry, with representations of the three fates spinning the thread of time, conveying that fate and time can lead, in this case, to a complete reversal of fortune, for Pope Leo, for the Medici, and through Leo for the Church. The tapestries, therefore, with their multi-part compositions, promote Leo as a leader of healing and renewal for the Church, fated to become Pope, and destined to bring the Medici family to new glory through the papacy. They also argue with their stories of Saints Peter and Paul for the Pope's role as head of the Church, as designated by Christ, countering contemporary criticism. Messages extolling Pope Leo and his reign and the Medici family also appear in another set of tapestries, the Grotesques of Leo X, and at the same time reflect recent events. Raphael's composition linked the ancient world to that of early 16th century Rome by presenting figures and scenes from classical mythology. As we see, the compositions each feature a mythological figure at the center, which we can see here and here, set in an elaborate three-tiered architectural framework with figures, narrative scenes, and grotesques. On the lower left, the centaur Nessus tries to abduct Hercules' new bride. Oops. Sorry. At the center, at the lower left, the centaur Nessus tries to abduct Hercules' new bride, Daenerys, but Hercules shoots him with an arrow. At the top are medallions with stories from Hercules' childhood. At the left, he wrestles two serpents in his cradle. At the right, Hercules pursues his education. Putti and grotesques surround these scenes to fill the top section of the composition. A figure of fame stands above the pavilion that frames Hercules. To depict these classical subjects, Raphael and his assistants studied examples of ancient art that were known in the early 16th century and carefully selected elements to incorporate, as we can see here. The composition with several separate, as you can see here, Hercules' labors in the middle section of the tapestry seen here at the top are derived from sarcophagi, as Nello Fortegrazzini and Tom Campbell first noted. For example, this sarcophagus that was in the Savelli collection in Rome in the early 16th century. Each figural group is framed by an arcade, as we see in the tapestry. The composition with several separate sections, I would suggest, is derived from fourth-style Roman wall painting. While the exact model's probably lost, and this example's from Pompeii, we know that Raphael, Giovanni da Udine, and others in the workshop studied the grotesque decoration similar to this in the ruins of Nero's Golden House, the Domus Aurea. The Hercules tapestry then presents classical subjects in a style imitating the sculpture and painting of ancient Rome. Raphael's antique designs, however, were planned for the Pope, the head of the Christian Church, whose doctrine had ostensibly rejected the pantheon of ancient gods. How did viewers at the Vatican Palace perceive this overtly pagan imagery? What was the message? What message did the designs convey? For the Renaissance scholar, Hercules represented virtue. His labors paralleled the struggles of the Christian soul to attain salvation. In fact, this interpretation appeared in Boccaccio's Genealogy, where Hercules is referred to as a god of virtue, and in the book Hercules Vita that Lelio Gregorio Giraldi completed at the Vatican in 1513. Hercules' descent to the underworld and return to earth, depicted on the tapestry's lower left, for Renaissance viewers paralleled Christ's death and resurrection. Hercules' bride, Dinera, represents the Christian soul that God must deliver from the devil who tries to steal away with her, according to the Ovid Marlyse. At the tapestry's upper left and right, pelicans open their breasts to feed their young with their own flesh and blood. They symbolize Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. The Christian themes of struggle, redemption, and resurrection are represented here and in the other tapestries in the set. I would suggest, with carefully chosen classical imagery that reinforces the conception of the resurrection and the immortality of the soul. In fact, in 1513, Pope Leo X issued a papal bull, the Doctrine of the Immortality of the Soul. The nature of the immortal soul was much debated by humanists such as Marsilio Ficino in the 15th century and clerics Jacopo Sadoletto and Giles of Viterbo in the 16th century. This issue also occupied Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici. About 1511, he even took part in a debate on it. As Pope, Leo acted to clarify the Church's position on this key concept of Christianity. The classical subjects of the tapestries then, suggesting a continuum between the ancient and modern Rome, were carefully selected to express the central tenet of Christian theology, the Christian promise of salvation and eternal life, that had been affirmed as doctrine by Pope Leo with his papal bull. For the third set of strikingly original designs by Raphael in his workshop, The Playing Children, meaning is carried not by figures and stories, but by symbols and devices. These include, as we see here from the left, a tiara, papal crown, keys and a lion, a yoke and diamond ring, an ostrich, a peacock, and a rabbit. I'd now like to look more closely at the Playing Children tapestries to explore their designs and to consider their meaning. Raphael in his workshop created the compositions about 1519-20. We know that Tommaso Vinciador, an assistant, was sent to Brussels in May 1520, a few weeks after Raphael's unexpected death. His task was to produce cartoons to be woven by Peter van Elst in his workshop. Presumably, Vinciador took designs that had been conceived by Raphael and approved by Leo. The tapestries woven for the Vatican are lost, but in the 19th century, Eugène Muntz identified the designs, and today they can be studied through 17th century reweavings, including the 4 we see here today in Budapest, as well as 2 tapestries in New York. Some designs are preserved in early 16th century drawings, including these attributed to Vinciador. And in 16th century engravings, for example, these by the master of the die. The unusual designs look to the ancient world, as the Grotesques did. Swagged garlands derived from Roman garland sarcophagi, such as the one we see here. The subject, too, came from the ancient world, inspired by the Imagines by Philostratus, the 4th century Greek writer, as Rolf Quedno, Alexandra Corey, and others have discussed. In this text, Philostratus describes works of art including one of Cupids in an orchard collecting fruit, another of children hunting down a rabbit that had been eating apples, and both subjects are found in the playing children designs. The compositions also feature personal symbols of Pope Leo. And here we see in this tapestry 2 winged children, or putti, playing with a yoke. We can see the yoke here. A third at the center foreground reaches for a diamond ring laced with 3 feathers. As Pope, Leo adopted the yoke as his personal emblem, along with the Medici diamond ring. He took the motto, "The ring unites and the burden is light." This emblem positioned his papacy as one of unity and of compassion and clemency. Traditional symbols of the papacy are also depicted. Here, a Puto at the right holds a tall papal crown, while another soaring above carries the keys of St. Peter, symbols of spiritual authority. A lion, another symbol of Pope Leo, wears an earthly crown evoking temporal rule, as do the crown and scepter held by the Puto at the left. This theme of spiritual and temporal power is seen again in another design, known through a drawing and print. A Puto poses with one foot on a globe, imitating ancient Roman emperors. He carries a scepter and wears a crown, all evoking political rule. A halo also surrounds his head, suggesting the spiritual, as Claude now has discussed, as does above the Puto's head a radiating sun, its light a symbol of Christ. The terrestrial globe is seen again in another design. Here, putti joyfully dance around a globe. A palm tree spreads its branches above. We see the putti's dance circle as an image of unity, echoing the Medici ring of Pope Leo's emblem. The palm tree, symbol of regeneration, promises renewal. In yet another design, a Puto stationed high up in a tree is about to throw a globe at his companion, who unconcernedly eats an apple beneath him. The designs, very different from the acts in the grotesques, are each charming, playful, and even comic. Yet embedded in their imagery are serious references to both the spiritual power and temporal power of Leo's papacy, that Leo's papacy felt compelled at the time to claim. The tapestries were planned and designed about 1519-20, when challenges once again faced the papacy. In 1517, Martin Luther questioned the roles of the Pope and the Church when he posted his 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. In 1519, a new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, was elected, who was seen as a threat to the Pope's rule over the Papal States in central Italy. The papacy's claim for spiritual and temporal power was also the theme of the painted decoration that Raphael in his workshop devised for the Vatican's Hall of Constantine, as Quednow and others have shown. Painted frescoes, cleverly conceived as faux tapestries, present scenes from the life of Constantine, the Roman emperor who recognized Christianity in 313 CE, and in 330 moved his capital to the new city of Constantinople, leaving Rome to be governed by the Pope. The playing children panels were planned to hang along the lower part of the walls as a real tapestry border for the painted faux tapestries above. An observer in the late 16th century described the room's lower walls as, quote, covered continuously with tapestries in silk and gold, unquote. They created a clever visual counterpoint to the expansive narratives, and they continued and augmented the message of papal power. In addition to claiming power for the papacy, the tapestries may also represent the virtues of Leo as Pope. In this design, 2 putti hold an exotic ostrich, while another tries to steal a feather from the bird's tail. 3 ostrich feathers were a device of the Medici family from the 15th century, and we saw the 3 feathers encircled by the Medici diamond ring in the foreground of the tapestry, with putti playing with a yoke and diamond ring. The ostrich and its feathers carried additional meaning for the Renaissance viewer. The bird's feathers were of equal length, which was read as a symbol of justice. Justice, along with other virtues claimed for Pope Leo, also appears in the painted decoration of Vatican's Hall of Constantine, as we see here. A personification of justice appears to the far right of the panoramic scene, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and on the right we see a detail. The figure of justice, painted by Raphael himself, holds her traditional attribute, a set of scales. But instead of her usual sword, she's accompanied by an ostrich, creating a visual and symbolic link with the tapestry. While further research is needed to more fully interpret the Playing Children tapestries, the designs, I suggest, aim to respond to contemporary events that threaten the spiritual and temporal power of the papacy. At the same time, they signal the virtues of Leo and his papal reign. So in conclusion, ultimately with the Acts of the Apostles, the Grotesques of Leo X, and the Playing Children, Raphael and his workshop ingeniously visualized intricate theological and political programs that extolled Pope Leo, his papacy, and the Medici family. And as I've argued here, the tapestry signs also worked as timely propaganda, promoting specific events and policies and addressing challenges to the papacy and to the rule of their patron, Pope Leo X. Thank you.
So, sorry. We'll have time now for a Q&A for any of our four speakers, and then, depending on whom you're asking, I might invite the speaker to come up to give their answer.
Should I go first? Okay, I have a question for Lorraine. I'm right behind you. I was wondering what the small yellow circles are on the top of the dancing, playing children tapestries. Are those woven images of a hanging apparatus? I was just curious about that.
Okay, is this working? So I'm sorry, do you mind repeating the question?
Right here.
Over there. Oh, the small circles.
Yes, the small circles at the top of the playing children tapestries. Are those part of the tapestry design? What are those?
Oh, that extra.
Yeah.
Well, they're reweavings.
Okay.
So I think you're probably seeing the possibly an extra part that was added in the 17th century, where we're not sure actually.
Okay.
We're not sure what the original's design looked like. So it's a question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, though.
Hi, I had a question for Helen. I enjoyed everybody's paper very much, but Helen, my question for you is, in this really dicey climate of debate, were the craftspeople or the workshop, the Mortlake workshop, how were they implicated in this? Were they called to account at all for having made these tapestries?
Not as far as we can tell, but after 1641, the king was cut off from the treasury, and so there was no more money reaching the workshop. And so they asked permission numerous times to sell tapestries which they'd made for the king or other patrons which hadn't been paid for. And so at that time, some interesting things travelled out of the country. So yeah, they were in there's one letter where they're saying, we're starving at our looms, we need help. So they're pleading for commissions and then permission to sell things. But I don't think there was any sense that they were seen as implicated in, the use of the tapestries. Although, at that date, most of them were Protestant. Later, you have Catholic weavers coming to London, and there were problems associated with that. But yeah, it was more they were just starving.
A question back there. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question for Pascal about the Battle of Troy tapestries, especially the inscriptions that I'm really interested in. If I understood correctly, there's a debate around adding the inscriptions back and in which language to do so, in Latin or French. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and why the inscriptions were lost before? Thank you.
Thank you. You speak about the inscription in the first tapestries at the Gobelin for the Iliad or the
yes.
Trojan War. The inscriptions are in Latin. And that means that they came from a man of letters, a writer who gave the concerto of the set, who was conservative in his spirit, because in the quarrel between the ancient and the modern, the ancients want to have Latin inscription and modern want to have French inscription. Is that what you want?
Why were the inscriptions not already included on the scene? I seem to get that you said that they were there before initially, and then maybe the borders were removed, and then they were added back, or simply at the first weaving they were not included, and then.
There, if I understand, I'll show you one tapestry with the border. The other tapestry lost its border.
Okay.
Yes, I don't say that. And I cut many things to be in the timing. And the second tapestry, the death of Achilles, was the border where have been removed. I don't know when, but when the tapestry was in the full collection in New York, there's no border.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Tom?
I've got a quick question for Helen. Helen, in your paper, I think you give a fantastic contextualization of the Supper at Emmaus tapestry that was presumably commissioned by Laud. Now, that's one of what, 3 or 4 known weavings of that design. Do the other weavings also have the faux fringe, or is that specific to the Laud piece?
It's only that one. They each have a different border, but the history and the others all post-date Charles I's reign. The earliest is probably the one at Hardwick, which seems to have been hung in a secular setting in Christian Bruce's London house alongside a set of horses tapestries. It did later end up in the chapel at Hardwick, because I think there was a sense of that being what that tapestry was for. There's one at Windsor, which was woven after 1660, and that was given to St. George's Chapel, Windsor, in the 1660s, and hung over an altar. And I think that shows there was a memory that that was the function of there's a lot of circumstantial evidence for that size and type of tapestry being hung over altars in England in the 17th century. And then there's one that surfaced in France, which Jean published in your Louis XIV tapestries book, which has new borders, so we don't know. But that one went to France at some point, possibly along with all of those other tapestries that ended up in France in the 17th century. So the date of that one I'm less sure of. But yeah, this is the only one where you really feel somebody thinking about the liturgical meaning of a textile. The others are more standard architectural borders.
Thank you.
Yes, Lizzie.
Hello, thanks for some fantastic papers this morning. I have a quick question for Jean. I'm not sure there is an answer, but it was so fascinating to see Audran's designs for a completely new group, a set of 3 series of tapestries for Marly. And one could see, certainly with the middle group, with the spectacles and with the monkeys, some parallels with the Berlin Grotesques, but also a lot of differences. And I find it therefore very strange that I don't think we see any echoes of these series being used then in subsequent tapestry designs. Louis XIV rejects it, and then that's it for Audran's designs, which seems a great shame. Have you come across any other series where he's repurposing some of these ideas after the king's rejection, or was that the end for those designs?
Repeat quickly your question. It's a new discovery, so I don't know all the details, but it's unusual in the style of the time of Louis XIV, and apparently it has been stopped because of the financial problem. But also perhaps for a reason of style, because Audran was a very original designer, and with the monkeys and even the acrobats. The theme is very special, and it's the only case of this kind of iconography in royal palaces at the time. And, perhaps it will be possible to precise some detail after. But I think what I can say is that in the castle of Marly, probably was very different from Versailles, for example, because it was less rigid. So with what we know of the style of Versailles, we are a bit surprised, but perhaps in fact it is not. Thank you.
Thank you.
And question back there? Yes.
This is a question for Jean as well. Am I echoing? I may have misunderstood you, but it sounded like you were saying that the image of Cybele, or the woman with the olive, and the cornucopia had something to do with an image that was about the Spanish succession. Is that correct?
Why not? Why not?
Why not?
That's a good...
Oh, I thought that you had made that.
That's a good idea. I have to...
Okay. And then my other question to you is the use of monkeys as mischief. Do you see them often in the borders of tapestries from the period of Louis XIV's or later?
Not really. Monkeys appear only with the art of Audran. Okay. But we find monkeys in the paintings, in the decorative paintings sure. by Audran on the ceilings. He painted, but the problem of the drawings of Audran in Stockholm is that there is no annotation. So generally, we don't know for which castle or house the drawings were made. But in all the drawings by Audran, there are often monkeys. But it's very special to Audran, to my opinion. But there are monkeys on the tapestry of the 12 months done for the Grand Dauphin in Meudon. Not much monkeys, but
there are monkeys as well in the borders of the Valois tapestries. Which I believe are of a much later.
Yes, that's a good remark.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for your opinion.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank all our speakers. Yes. Thank you to the audience and to all those watching online as well. We're going to have a break now for lunch. I want to remind everyone at 1 o'clock, there will be a lecture in this theater, part of our Closer Look series, which celebrates the Legion's centennial. The second Saturday of every month, you'll hear some aspect about the Legion's collection, and today, we're very fortunate, the speaker will be the curator in charge of our textile and costumes, Laura Camerlengo. So that will be at 1 o'clock here. And we're not going to clear the theater, right? So if you want to stay, or, it will be here in an hour. And then the second session with 2 more tapestry papers will commence at 2 o'clock this afternoon. So thank you all.